On December the 2nd, 1936, John Ringling died in New York City with $311 in his bank account. He had once owned nearly every circus in America, built a fortune near $50 million, and poured it into dredging islands from Sarasota Bay, a causeway across open water, and a 56-room palace on the shore. But by then the estate was valued on paper near $23,500,000, frozen by debt and lawsuit, and Ringling died a day before movers came to empty the mansion and sell its contents. His name is not hidden. It marks a museum, a causeway, and the city of Sarasota itself. What is hidden is how the man behind all three died owing more than he owned, and why the state that inherited his empire spent a decade fighting his creditors in court to keep it. The unraveling began with one night of pride in 1929 when a snub at Madison Square Garden pushed Ringling to buy 5 rival circuses for $1,700,000 against half his own pledged stock. It deepened with a wife who built the Sarasota vision beside him and did not live to see how it ended, and with a second marriage that collapsed into the costliest divorce Florida had ever recorded. That story starts decades earlier, with 5 brothers running a hall and wagon show out of Baraboo, Wisconsin. Chapter 1. 5 Brothers and a Borrowed Tent. Every part of the empire the Ringling name would eventually attach to, the dredged islands, the causeway, the palace on the bay, all of it traces back to a single Wisconsin milling town and 5 brothers who did not yet own a tent to call their own. John Ringling was the youngest of them, born on the 31st of May, 1866, in the river town of McGregor, Iowa. By the time he was grown, his older brothers Al, Otto, Alf T., and Charles had already spent years chasing the same modest ambition he would eventually inherit and outgrow: getting a traveling show, any traveling show, in front of an audience willing to pay for it. On the 19th of May, 1884, the 5 brothers founded the Ringling Brothers Circus in Baraboo, Wisconsin, a milling town on the Baraboo River with no prior claim to circus history beyond the family that had just settled there. The beginning was as small as beginnings get. There was no big top raised over sawdust, no menagerie tent, none of the canvas empire the Ringling name would later be known for. The earliest seasons ran out of rented town halls and a covered wagon, a hall and wagon show in the plainest sense the term allows, 5 brothers scouting each town's willingness to pay before they risked the trip, packing up before the welcome ran out, and starting over in the next county on whatever road the wagon could manage. It was a business built on nerve more than capital. 5 brothers meant 5 sets of hands to unload the wagon, 5 sets of eyes to read a town's mood before deciding whether to raise a show there at all, and no cushion if a rented hall stood half empty on a bad night. There was no circus fortune yet, no Sarasota, no coastline anywhere in the plan. There was a wagon, a route through the small towns of the upper Midwest, and 5 brothers from Baraboo betting that persistence would outlast the odds against them. Some who follow circus history will look at that beginning and see the classic builder's story. 5 brothers with nothing but a wagon and a rented hall, turning persistence into an empire through decades of honest work. Others will look at the same beginning and see the first evidence of an appetite that would not stop growing until it had swallowed every rival circus left standing in the country. Both readings are already present at the very start, because in 1884 the 5 brothers in Baraboo do not yet know which one they are about to become, and neither does anyone watching them arrive in another small town with nothing to their name but a wagon and a borrowed hall. What the brothers did have, even then, was proximity to the industry's real giant. Touring the same circuit, filling the same fairgrounds and rivertown lots the Ringlings could only rent by the day, was Barnum and Bailey, the largest circus in America, and the standard every smaller outfit in the country measured itself against and assumed it would never reach. The reputation Barnum and Bailey had spent decades building was not something five brothers with a wagon and a rented hall could contest, not yet, and nothing in Baraboo in 1884 suggested that would ever change. That gap would not last. Chapter 2. They bought the rival that owned them. That gap between the Ringling Brothers' rented halls and the towering standard of Barnum and Bailey did not close because the brothers finally outworked it. It closed because the family that owned Barnum and Bailey decided to sell. In 1907, the owners of the Barnum and Bailey Circus, the same outfit that had spent decades filling the fairgrounds and Rivertown lots the Ringlings could only rent by the day, agreed to part with it. The five brothers from Baraboo bought their way into the company whose reputation they had chased across 20 years of rented halls and covered wagons. The reported price was $400,000, paid for the name, the equipment, the rail cars, and the roots of what had been, until that transaction, the largest circus enterprise in the country. No one in Baraboo in 1884 had written that figure into any plan. A wagon show scouting a town's willingness to pay before it risked the trip had no use for a number that size, and the brothers themselves had spent those early seasons counting nickels and half-empty halls, not rival corporations. 23 years later, the same five men signed for $400,000 and took possession of the one outfit that had always stood just out of reach. Owning a rival that size was one problem. Deciding what to do with it was another, and the brothers did not fold Barnum and Bailey into their own show, and they did not shut either operation down. They ran both. 2 full circus trains went out across the country's rail lines in the same season, under separate canvas, separate posters, and separate names, while the same 5 brothers in Baraboo read the receipts coming back from both. No family in American circus history had owned both halves of a rivalry that size at once, and the effect showed up almost immediately. With the one show capable of matching the Ringlings now under the Ringlings' own ownership, there was no competitor left in the country large enough to contest either train, let alone both of them running at the same time. The irony sat in plain view for anyone who had followed the brothers from the beginning. The 5 men who had once packed up a rented hall before a town's welcome ran out, now held the deed to the very outfit that had set the standard they had spent 2 decades failing to reach. The show that had once made the Ringlings look small now answered to them. Whatever the brothers had been in 1884, 5 names on a wagon with no tent of their own, they were no longer that, and the change had come not from a single triumphant season under canvas, but from a purchase agreement and $400,000. It also came with a weight the brothers had not carried before. A single wagon and a rented hall could be managed by 5 men, trading the same handful of decisions back and forth around a kitchen table. 2 circus trains running simultaneously under one ownership in different states on different nights could not. Every ticket booth on both shows now fed the same accounts. Every rail contract on both trains now drew against the same credit. And every decision about where to route which train next carried the weight of a company that no longer resembled the outfit that had left Baraboo in 1884. Someone had to decide which show played which territory, how the combined receipts were kept, and how fast an enterprise that size could grow before its own debts grew to match it. The brothers had built something too large for 5 equal hands to hold at once. They had not yet settled which of them would hold the ledger that mattered most. Chapter 3. The Brother Who Moved the Money. The answer to who would hold that ledger had been sitting in plain view since Baraboo, and it was not one of the four brothers who had built the largest tent or drawn the loudest crowd. It was the youngest of them. John Ringling had spent 20 years watching where the money came from and where it had to go next, and once 2 circus trains needed one set of books instead of 5 men trading decisions around a kitchen table, there was no real vote to hold. Al, Otto, Alf T., and Charles each carried their own portion of the enterprise, the parts of the business a crowd could see from the grandstand. John carried the arithmetic of it, the rail contracts, the routing that decided which town saw which show on which date, and the accounts that had to balance across a business now too large for any one memory to hold. That work never drew applause, and it was never meant to. An outfit moving through 100 towns a season ran on that arithmetic as much as it ran on spectacle, and the brother who kept it running was the brother who, without any announcement or any vote taken, had become the one who moved the money. The same instinct that let him carry 2 circus trains in his head at once found a second use closer to home. In 1905, John Ringling married Mable Burton, and the marriage put a second mind into a ledger that had, until then, been his to keep alone. She was not a passenger in what the marriage would go on to produce, and she was not merely along for whichever city the show's next winter quarters happened to fall in. She read plans the way he read routing sheets, and the partnership between them would outlast the circus business itself, reaching into ground neither of them had yet purchased and outliving investments the rest of the family never touched. 4 years later, in 1909, the couple began wintering on Florida's Gulf Coast in the small fishing town of Sarasota. There was nothing unusual on its face in a wealthy showman keeping a warm-weather address. Circus families had wintered south of the frozen rail lines for decades, chasing the same mild season the show itself chased every fall. Sarasota in 1909 was still a quiet harbor town, its economy built on fish houses and citrus groves rather than on visitors, the kind of place a man could sit on a porch above the bay and hear very little but water. But John Ringling did not sit on porches the way other men sat on porches. He looked at open ground the same way he looked at a rail schedule, as territory waiting to be routed, financed, and made to answer for itself. What he saw across that bay was not a resort. It was raw shoreline and a scatter of barrier islands still shaped by tide and current rather than by any surveyor's line, sitting largely unclaimed off a town too small to have decided yet what it wanted to become. Mabel saw a place worth building into something lasting, a winter address that could grow into a life. John saw the same water and began doing, quietly, what he had always done with an asset that looked unfinished. He started running the numbers on what it would take to make it his, the same way he had once run the numbers on a rival circus until the price made sense. Neither of them yet knew how far that calculation would reach, how many acres of bay bottom it would eventually claim, or how much of a fortune built on canvas and rail contracts was about to be poured, piling by piling, into the floor of the sea itself. Chapter 4. The Islands. He dredged from the sea. The piling went into the bay bottom before either of them had drawn a plan a bank would have recognized. Ringling had run the numbers on that shoreline the way he once ran them on a rival circus, and by 1917 the arithmetic had produced a partner and a method. The partner was a Sarasota developer named Owen Burns, a man who already held title to a stretch of the town's waterfront and who understood, the way Ringling did, that the barrier islands scattered off the coast were not obstacles standing in front of a resort. They were raw material. Neither man came to the arrangement empty-handed. Burns knew the local title records, the channels, the county officials who had to sign off before a shovel of bay bottom could legally become a lot. Ringling brought the one thing Burns could not raise on his own: circus money. The same fortune that had bought out a rival show a decade earlier, now redirected from canvas and rail cars into fill sand and seawall. Mabel had a hand in the arrangement, too, the way she had a hand in every plan that touched the property. She was the one who kept pressing for something more permanent than a winter address, and it was her insistence, as much as her husband's arithmetic, that turned a partnership on paper into dredges actually working the channel. What lay offshore in 1917 was barely land at all. Sandbars and marsh grass, mangrove roots holding a shape the tide erased twice a day, ground too soft to carry a road and too shallow to carry a boat. Burns and Ringling did not wait for that ground to become worth something on its own. They built the worth into it directly. Dredges pulled mud and sand up from the bay bottom and pumped it onto the sandbars until land that had answered to the tide for longer than any surveyor had bothered to measure finally answered to a property line instead. Seawalls went in behind the fill to hold what the dredges had raised, so a falling tide could no longer take back what a machine had just given it. It went on for years. Through the last stretch of the 1910s and into the early 1920s, the same dredge boats worked the same channel again and again, enlarging one island, then squaring off the next, until the scattered sandbars off Sarasota had become a connected shelf of ground solid enough to be surveyed, platted, and sold. What Ringling and Burns raised there, and what came to be known locally as the Ringling Isles, was said at the time to be one of the largest land reclamation projects attempted anywhere in Florida, and the claim was not advertising copy. It was engineering. A fortune built on canvas tents and rail contracts was going, yard by yard, into ground that had not existed a few years before. The instinct that had once told him which town could support a second circus tent now told Ringling which sandbar could support a hotel foundation. He and Burns were not restoring a natural harbor. They were manufacturing one, out of bay bottom nobody had thought worth surveying until a man who had spent 20 years moving circus trains decided it would be. Where other developers waited for a market to prove itself before they touched the ground, Ringling built the ground first and waited for the market to catch up to what he had already made. There was nothing modest about the ambition sitting behind the dredge boats. Sarasota in the 1910s was still the fish house town it had been when the Ringlings first wintered there, its whole economy resting on citrus groves and the harbor. What Burns and Ringling were assembling offshore, island by enlarged island, was meant to become something else entirely. House lots facing open water, a shoreline built for people who had never seen Sarasota Bay and did not yet know they wanted to. The circus had taught Ringling that an audience did not exist until someone built the tent and the railroad that brought them to it. The islands were the same wager, run in sand instead of canvas. He was not selling Florida land that already had buyers waiting. He was building land that had no buyers yet, on the bet that once it existed, the buyers would follow the same instinct that had always followed him to the show. But raised land is not by itself a destination. An island built up out of a bay is still an island, cut off from the mainland by the very water that had made it worth reclaiming in the first place, and a resort no one could reach was worth nothing at all, however many acres a dredge had pumped into being. Ringling had solved the problem of land. He had not solved the problem of distance, and the ground he and Burns had spent years raising out of Sarasota Bay would sit empty, however solid it now stood underfoot, until somebody built a way across the water that had made it an island to begin with. Chapter 5. The bridge he built and gave away. The way across the water was a bridge, and Ringling built it before anyone with capital to lose would have called it a sound investment. A resort assembled out of raised sandbars was still, by any surveyor's definition, a set of islands. And an island a buyer could only reach by hired boat was an island that stayed unsold. So, where the dredges had spent years manufacturing land, Ringling now spent money manufacturing a road to it, pilings driven into the bay, a deck laid across them, a causeway running from the Sarasota mainland out to the keys his crews had spent years raising out of the tide. It was, in its way, the same wager he had made with the islands themselves, doubled. He had already bet that buyers would want ground that did not yet exist. Now he was betting they would cross open water to reach it on a bridge that no city government had asked him to build, and no developer's ledger required him to pay for outright. He paid for it anyway, the same instinct that had once laid rail spurs into towns too small to justify a circus stop, now laying a road into a resort too new to justify the expense. Ringling did not wait for Sarasota to grow into a place that needed a bridge. He built the bridge and let the town grow to meet it. Once the crossing existed, he treated the arrival end of it the way a showman treats the entrance to a tent. On the quay at the far end of the crossing, where the causeway came ashore, Ringling laid out a circular plaza he named St. Armands Circle, ringed with lots meant for shops and hotels, the kind of address a visitor would remember rather than merely pass through. It was not a road interchange. It was a stage set for a town that had not finished being built yet, and everyone crossing the new bridge would cross it first. Then he gave the bridge away. The causeway that had cost him to plan, finance, and build passed into the hands of the city of Sarasota, a public crossing now, free to any fisherman or grove worker who had spent years reaching the mainland by whatever boat happened to be heading that direction that morning. The islands stopped being a private wager the moment the road onto them stopped being a private toll. Ringling kept the land. He gave up the one thing that made the land worth anything at all, and the town took it without ever having to build it itself. He was not finished giving ground away. Further up the chain of keys, on Longboat Key, Ringling donated roughly 120 acres outright. Land meant not for house lots he could sell, but for a golf course and a country club, built to draw the kind of visitor who would not come for sand alone. A circus man understood, better than most developers of his era, that an audience needed a reason to stay once it had paid to get in. The golf course was that reason. Planted on ground he could have sold and instead simply handed over, on the calculation that a visitor with somewhere to spend an afternoon was a visitor who came back. But a bridge, a traffic circle, and a golf course were the frame around an empty picture. Ringling had built the road to the islands and the reason to linger on them. He had not yet built the one structure meant to announce, the moment a visitor crossed that new causeway and looked out toward the bay, that a circus fortune had come to Sarasota to stay. That structure was still to come. Chapter 6. A palace raised on a fading boom. A bridge, a traffic circle, and a golf course had announced that a fortune had arrived on the bay. They had not announced whose fortune it was. So, on a stretch of waterfront just south of the causeway he had already given away, Ringling began building the one structure a visitor could not mistake for a public improvement, a house meant to be looked at from the water the way a circus tent is meant to be looked at from the midway. He hired Dwight James Baum, a New York architect who had built country houses for people with old money, and asked him for something closer to a doge's palace than a Florida winter cottage. Mable had her own hand in it, too, the woman who had wintered on this shoreline with him since 1909 and watched the islands rise out of the bay one dredge load at a time. The design that finally went to the builders carried as much of her taste as his ambition. Between them, they settled on Venetian Gothic, Pointed arches copied from a building on the Grand Canal, a loggia open to the water where the bay wind could move straight through the house, a bell tower deliberately raised above every roofline on that shore, terracotta and colored brick brought south to a coastline that had never worn either. The house that finally answered the causeway's promise opened its doors in 1926, ran to 56 rooms across something near 36,000 square feet, and cost, by the reckoning of the men who signed the invoices, close to $1.5 million. A tower built taller than anything else on that shoreline, so a boat coming up the bay would see it before it saw anything else Sarasota had to offer. He named it Ca d'Izan, House of John, in the Venetian dialect, and the name went up over a front door built to be photographed rather than merely used. It was, by any measure available in 1926, the single largest private statement circus money had ever made on the American landscape. But the ground under that statement was no longer as solid as the marble laid across it. The same Florida land boom that had made buyers cross Ringling's new bridge by the thousand, that had turned raw, dredged sandbars into lots worth real money, was already losing its nerve by the time the tower went up. Prices that had climbed for years without pause had begun to stall in pockets up and down the coast, buyers growing harder to find, financing growing harder to arrange. The easy money that had funded island after island starting, quietly, to tighten. None of that stopped the house. Ringling kept building through it, the way a man builds a monument to a fortune he is confident will keep renewing itself. He had bet on raw sandbars and won. He had bet on a bridge nobody asked him to build and won. A palace, finished at the top of a boom just beginning to lose its footing, was simply the same wager stated in marble and terracotta instead of dredged sand, and a showman who had spent 30 years reading a circus crowd's mood from the back of a tent saw no reason yet to read this one any differently. For a season it looked like vindication. Ca d'Izan stood finished on the bay exactly as he had planned it, the tallest and most expensive private house the Gulf Coast had ever seen, proof visible from the water that a circus family from Baraboo, Wisconsin, now belonged among the men who built palaces rather than merely visited them. Winters filled the ballroom with guests who had crossed the same bridge Ringling had given the city for nothing. Boats slowed on the bay to look at the tower. Nobody standing on the new marble in 1926 was counting the months. But a house, however large, was not the only thing a circus fortune could still buy, and Ringling was not a man who finished a project and simply lived inside it. He had built the islands, the bridge, the plaza, and now the palace, each one a stage set for the next, each one paid for by a boom he had not yet stopped believing in. The palace announced that he belonged among men of taste as well as men of money. What it did not yet contain was anything that proved the taste itself, and John Ringling already knew where in Europe he intended to go looking for it. Chapter 7. The Masters. He bought with circus money. He did not go to Europe as a tourist. Ringling crossed the Atlantic the way he had once crossed the Midwest with a wagon show, hunting inventory, except the inventory this time hung on the walls of chapels, manor houses, and the private galleries of families who had held it for generations. A circus man who had spent 30 years selling wonder to a paying crowd at the gate now stood in front of European Old Master paintings and began writing checks for them, one canvas at a time, the way another man might buy land. The irony traveled with him. The same showman who had spent his working life reading a crowd's mood from the back of a tent was now reading a different audience, one that judged a man by the age and pedigree of what hung on his walls rather than by the size of the tent he had filled. Ringling wanted both judgments to land in his favor. Ca d'Izan had already proved the money, The paintings were meant to prove the taste, and taste, in the rooms he now wished to be let into, could not be improvised or bought in bulk. It had to be acquired one verified piece at a time, from sellers who had inherited a canvas and needed cash more than they needed the wall space it had always occupied. He went dealer by dealer, gallery by gallery, a man who had spent his life pricing sideshow acts, now pricing centuries, and he brought agents and experts along to do the part of the judging his own eye could not yet do alone. It was slow work, unglamorous compared to raising an island out of a bay or a bridge across open water, conducted in back rooms and drawing rooms rather than in front of a paying crowd. No one applauded a completed purchase the way they had once applauded a trapeze act landing clean. But each crated canvas that went aboard a ship for Florida was, to Ringling, the same kind of proof the islands and the bridge had already offered, just addressed to a different jury. He did not simply carry the paintings back to Sarasota and hang them inside the mansion he had already finished. He built them a house of their own, a museum raised beside Kadzan and meant to outlast it, purpose-built to hold a collection that a showman from Baraboo, Wisconsin, had assembled one transatlantic crossing at a time. On the bay, where a bridge, a traffic circle, and a golf course had already announced the arrival of circus money, this was the strangest structure yet. Not a house to live in, not a road to drive across, not a plaza to shop in, but a building whose only occupants would be paintings, gathered by a man whose entire career had consisted of getting a crowd to look exactly where he pointed. That museum did not close when the rest of Ringling's ventures did. Long after the mansion changed hands, long after the causeway and the islands became civic infrastructure that Sarasota used without crediting the name on the deed, the building beside the bay kept its paintings and kept its purpose. It survives today as the John and Mable Ringling Museum of Art, the State Art Museum of Florida, the one piece of everything he built that no creditor ever had to be fought off to save. None of that permanence was visible yet in the years the checks were still being written. What was visible, to anyone who cared to look past the crated canvases coming off the boats, was a man spending circus money on European masters at the precise moment the ground under every dollar he owned had begun, quietly, to shift. The paintings were real. Their provenance was real. But the fortune paying for them no longer stood on the footing it had stood on when the first dredge lifted sand out of Sarasota Bay to build the islands underneath all of it, and a boom that had financed a bridge, a palace, and now a museum was not obligated to keep financing whatever Ringling decided to buy next. The reckoning for all of it, the islands, the palace, and now the paintings, was still a few years off. Chapter 8. The Boom That Broke Beneath Him. The masters had been bought, but the money that paid for them had never really left the ground it came from. It was Florida land, valued at whatever the next buyer could be talked into offering, and across the state, in the middle years of the 1920s, the supply of buyers willing to be talked into more had begun, quietly, to run out. The boom Ringling had ridden was not particular to Sarasota. Across the peninsula, raw scrubland and coastal swamp had been platted into lots, dredged into islands, and sold on paper at prices that assumed a buyer tomorrow would always pay more than the buyer today. Sarasota's own version of that boom was Ringling's own doing as much as anyone's. The isles he and Owen Burns had raised out of the bay, the causeway he had built and then given to the city, the traffic circle laid out for shops that did not yet exist. All of it was priced on the same assumption. Land was worth whatever the next signature said it was worth, and for a few good years, the next signature always arrived on schedule. Sa Dizan itself had gone up inside that assumption, a 56-room palazzo finished on the bay in the very years the state's paper fortunes were nearing their ceiling. The museum rising beside it, built to house the old masters he was still crossing the Atlantic to buy, stood on the same footing. None of it had been paid for out of a vault of settled cash, sitting idle and waiting. It stood on credit, on rising land values, and on the expectation that Florida's boom, like the circus before it, would keep filling the tent, no matter how large the tent got. By the middle of the decade, the tent had begun to empty. Buyers who had signed for lots on installment plans found the next payment due, and no second buyer waiting to take the lot off their hands at a profit. Prices that had climbed on expectation alone had nowhere further to climb once the expectation stopped renewing itself, and across the state, developments that had looked 2 years earlier like the surest fortunes in the country began quietly failing to close their sales. Sarasota was not spared the turn. The dredged islands still stood, the circle still stood, the causeway still carried its traffic, but the market that had justified financing all of it at the pace Ringling had financed it was no longer the market he had built it in. It is worth pausing on that gap, because it recurs in nearly every fortune this channel investigates. What outsiders can see, a palace, a causeway, a museum, is rarely proof of what has actually been paid for. If that gap is one you want kept in view story after story, subscribing costs nothing, and it keeps this kind of accounting arriving. Ringling did not stop building or buying when the ground under the boom began to soften. He had built his entire career on reading a crowd's appetite and betting ahead of it, in circus tents from Wisconsin to the eastern seaboard, and for 30 years that instinct had made him one of the richest men in the country. It told him now, as it always had, to press forward rather than retreat, and nothing yet in the ledgers proved the instinct wrong. The paintings kept arriving from Europe. The museum kept rising beside the mansion. But a fortune resting on land values that had stopped renewing themselves was a different kind of fortune than the one that had crossed the ocean a few years earlier, buying old canvases with the confidence of a man who believed the crowd would always come back for more. He was about to make the exposure worse, not better. In the autumn of 1929, an insult he took personally over a contract he believed belonged to him by right would send him looking not for a way to shore up what was already cracking beneath his feet, but for a way to spend still more, all of it committed in a single transaction large enough to answer the insult in kind. Chapter 9. The Night He Bought Every Circus. The insult arrived before the autumn did, and it arrived from the one address that mattered most. Madison Square Garden, the New York arena whose very existence Ringling had helped bring about, the hall where a Ringling show had announced the start of the season every spring for as long as most ticket buyers could remember, informed him that the coming year's exhibition date would not be his. He had filled it, spring after spring, with elephants and acrobats and the largest crowds the building drew all year, and now the booking that had always been his by habit, if not by right, was going somewhere else. He did not take it as a business decision. He took it as a betrayal, and a man who had spent 30 years reading a crowd's appetite before it knew its own mind was not built to absorb a betrayal quietly. Where another owner might have shored up what he already had, land bleeding value under him, a museum still filling with paintings not yet paid off, Ringling did the opposite. He went looking for the one purchase large enough to answer the insult in kind, and he found it in the American Circus Corporation, 5 shows running under 5 separate names: Sells Floto, Hagenbeck Wallace, John Robinson, Sparks, and Al G. Barnes, together the largest circus combine in the country outside his own. He bought all 5 in one transaction for $1,700,000. Those 5 names were not 5 small acts hoping to survive the season. Sells Floto, Hagenbeck Wallace, John Robinson, Sparks, and Al G. Barnes each ran its own trains, pitched its own tents, and booked its own route through its own share of the same small towns Ringling's own show depended on, and until that signature dried, they had done it as his competition. Every one of those 5 had spent years fighting Ringling's advance men for the same courthouse squares and county fairgrounds, undercutting his dates, splitting his audience, forcing his own routing office to work around them, town by town. A single afternoon erased all of it. There had been no merger fought out in a boardroom over months of maneuvering, and no hostile raid. A single signature did it, and when the ink dried, John Ringling controlled nearly every traveling circus operating on American soil, his own show, and the 5 he had just absorbed. A monopoly assembled in less time than it took most of his competitors to book a season. The company that had, in effect, carried the garden booking away from him now belonged to him outright, tent poles, rail cars, and performers' contracts included. There was no rival left standing who could have taken the exhibition date in the first place, because there was no rival left standing at all. For a few weeks that autumn, the man who had started as the youngest of 5 brothers running a wagon show out of Wisconsin owned something closer to the entire American circus industry than any single person ever had before him or would again. Told from a distance, at a dinner table or in a headline, it read as Conquest, the boy from Baraboo outbuilding every circus family in the country in a single afternoon. It was not, in the ledger that mattered, a purchase made from strength. It was a purchase made to answer a wound, financed at the worst possible moment to be financing anything on borrowed confidence, in a year when the ground under his own islands and his own palace had already begun quietly failing to hold its price. The fortune he was borrowing against rested on that same softening ground, and he had committed the whole difference to settling a grudge. He had not paid the $1,700,000 out of a vault of settled cash sitting idle any more than he had paid for Cadizan or the paintings that way. A fortune large enough to buy 5 circuses in a single afternoon does not simply appear in a checking account waiting to be spent. It has to be raised, and raising it means finding someone willing to lend against what a man already owns. He signed the purchase without hesitating over where the money would come from, the same instinct that had told him for 30 years to press forward rather than retreat. But the money to buy 5 circuses in a single afternoon had to come from somewhere, and the somewhere he chose to borrow it from would, before long, become the one lever anybody who wanted to take the empire away from him would need to pull. Chapter 10. The Widower and the Wrong Marriage. The signature that bought 5 circuses in a single afternoon was not the only paper Ringling put his name to in 1929. Before the year closed out, the woman who had wintered with him on this stretch of the Gulf Coast since 1909, the partner in the whole Sarasota vision from before there was a bridge or a dredged island to show for it, was dead. Mable had been his wife for 24 years. The record fixes the year of her death and offers little more beyond it. 1929, the same 12 months that carried the American Circus Corporation purchase, the same 12 months in which the stock market on Wall Street came apart. A fortune staked on a grudge, a national collapse still weeks away, and a wife of 24 years gone, all inside one calendar. He had built the Sarasota project as something closer to a partnership than a purchase, the 2 of them reading plans and routing sheets together for 2 decades. By the end of 1929, his partner in it was no longer there to see any of what came next. The mansion on the bay still stood, The museum built to house the old master paintings still rose beside it. But the woman who had shared that shoreline with him since before there was a bridge to cross it, who had read the plans for both buildings at his side, was gone from every room of them, and the man left behind was the one who had never learned how to stop building. He did not slow down. A man who had never once, in 3 decades of routing circus trains through 100 towns a season, let an open date sit unfilled, was not built to sit still with a loss either. Within a year of burying the wife who had helped build the whole coastline beside him, John Ringling married again. Her name was Emily Hogg Buck, and the wedding, like nearly everything else he did that decade, drew newspaper coverage. 1930. A second marriage arriving fast enough on the heels of the first that, to the papers watching, it read less like a man moving on than a man refusing to sit alone in a house built for 2. It did not hold. The marriage that began in 1930 came apart in public, in the courts, in a filing that dragged on for years and drew coverage well beyond Florida. Papers at the time called it the most expensive divorce the state had yet recorded. It was finalized on the 6th of July, 1936, 5 months before Ringling himself would be dead. There is a reading of this decade in which the second marriage was appetite, an aging man refusing to slow the pace that had already dredged a coastline out of the bay and bought a circus empire out of spite. There is a less generous reading, and probably a truer one, in which the marriage was simply one more transaction entered into by a man who had stopped being able to tell the difference between building something and refusing to stop. Either way, none of it, not the grief, not the second wedding, not the divorce that made headlines from Sarasota to New York, touched the one piece of paper that mattered more than all 3 combined. The $1,700,000 borrowed to buy 5 circuses in a single afternoon back in 1929 was still OWED, in full, to the men who had lent it. The stock he had pledged to secure that loan, half of everything he owned in his own circus company, was still sitting exactly where he had left it since the day he signed for it. In someone else's hands, waiting on an interest payment nobody had yet called due. The second marriage had absorbed his grief and his headlines, and none of it touched the one ledger that decided his future. The note was still outstanding. The men who held it were done waiting. Chapter 11. The Stock. He could not buy back. The note dated back to a prize fight, not a bank. The $1,700,000 Ringling had needed to buy 5 circuses in a single afternoon had, by report, been arranged ringside at a boxing match in 1929, and the collateral he put up to secure it was not real estate or a single canvas from the Old Master collection on the bay. It was the one asset every lender in the country understood the value of even in a falling market and understood exactly how to collect. He pledged half of his own stock in the circus company that carried his name to secure a loan he had taken out of spite, on a night when spite still felt like something he could afford. For a while the pledge cost him nothing. The combined circuses, 5 rivals folded into one operation overnight, kept the business running well enough that a debt of that size looked survivable on paper. The stock sat in the lender's hands the way collateral usually sits, a formality nobody expected to matter, a signature filed away and forgotten by everyone except the men who had written the terms. It would matter the day an interest installment came due that Ringling could not cover. The figure was small next to the loan behind it. $18,000 was all the note required at that particular deadline, a fraction of the $1,700,000 he had borrowed to begin with, the kind of sum a man who had once bought 5 circuses in an afternoon should have been able to produce without noticing. He did not have it ready, or could not move it fast enough, at the exact moment it was called. The paperwork that followed was signed while he was running a fever of 104 degrees, sick enough that the record notes it specifically, a man settling the terms of his own financial exposure from what amounted to a sickbed, too weak to fight for better terms and too exposed to refuse the ones he was given. It was a small failure measured against the size of the fortune it touched, and it was enough. Stock is pledged as security for exactly this reason, so that a missed payment converts a loan into a lever, and the men holding the paper understood the mechanism better than the man who had signed it. In a fever, understood the danger closing in on him. Half of his own company was no longer simply promised against a debt. It was now collectible, and every creditor who held a piece of that pledge knew it, and knew that a sick man missing one payment on one afternoon was worth more to them than the interest itself. Ringling had spent 3 decades routing circus trains through towns most bankers had never heard of, and in all that time he had never once let a scheduling conflict beat him. A missed interest payment, settled while too sick to argue the terms, was not the kind of problem 3 decades of routing experience could solve. It did not respond to the instincts that had built an empire out of tent stakes and rail timetables. It responded only to the language written into the loan itself, language he had agreed to in the confidence of a man who had never yet lost a hand he had dealt himself. The islands he had dredged from the bay, the causeway, the palace, the 5 circuses, bought in one vengeful afternoon, all of it still stood exactly as he had built it. The name was still on the tent, on the museum wall, on the deed to half a Florida coastline. But the paper that decided who actually controlled the company bearing his name was no longer entirely in his own hands, and the men who held the other half of that pledge had every legal reason to use it, and no particular reason left to wait. They did not wait long. The stock pledged at a prize fight to punish a rival was about to decide, in a boardroom instead of a ring, whether the man whose name was on every tent pole in America would still be the one running the show. Chapter 12. Voted out of his own name. The vote did not take long. In 1932, the board of directors of the circus that carried his name convened to decide what became of the man who had built it, and the outcome had already been written into the stock ledger months earlier, the night a fever-weak signature handed half his shares to men who had been waiting since a prize fight for exactly this moment. The board did not deliberate the way a family debates an aging patriarch. It voted the way creditors vote, by counting shares rather than years of service, and the shares that decided the count no longer belonged to him. He had walked into the circus business as the majority owner of an empire built tent by tent, town by town, circus by circus, across 3 decades. He walked out of that boardroom with a name and nothing left to attach to it. The board of directors stripped John Ringling of operating control of the company that carried his own surname, the surname on the marquee, on the payroll ledgers, on lot contracts, signed in 100 towns a season. The name remained his. The authority did not. In his place, the board installed Sam Gumpertz to run the company Ringling no longer controlled. Gumpertz took the office. He took the ledgers, he took the decisions that had once begun and ended with a single man's judgment about which town got the show this year and which one waited for the next. Ringling kept a diminished share of stock and a name on the letterhead. He could still walk the winter quarters of the company that had made him one of the wealthiest men in the country, but the decisions that moved inside it had passed to other men, and none of them needed his signature anymore. There was no appeal built into the arrangement, no clause in the pledge that let a man buy back his own authority once the shares had changed hands and the votes had been counted. He never regained control. There was no second vote to reverse the first, no maneuver from later years that bought the shares back, no return to the office he had once run by instinct and rail timetable. The man who had purchased 5 rival circuses in a single afternoon to prove a point about who controlled the American circus business now controlled none of it, not even the one still carrying his family's name from the marquee to the ticket wagon. What he had spent to win an argument with Madison Square Garden 3 years earlier was the very sum that had bought the votes now used against him. He had built the operation to run without needing his signature on every decision, the standing routes, the season contracts, the reputation attached to the name over the big top. That efficiency was precisely what made him replaceable. The company did not need John Ringling to keep functioning. It needed only the name, which the board still owned, and the routine, which Gumpertz now ran. The loan taken at a prize fight, the stock pledged in spite, the fevered signature on an $18,000 shortfall, all of it had been one mechanism completing its work, and it finished the job in a boardroom in 1932 without a single scene the newspapers could photograph. The circus went on that season without him at the wheel. It would go on for 4 more years before the wheel he had lost stopped mattering to him at all. Before a bank statement he could not dispute settled the true balance of everything he had built, and before an auctioneer, not a board of directors, decided what became of what still remained in his name. Chapter 13. The Auction He Did Not Live to See. The auction house had already catalogued the furniture. Appraisers had moved room to room through Kadzan on Sarasota Bay, tagging the tapestries, the gilded chairs, the imported marble a circus fortune had bought, and buyers were expected the following morning to bid on what remained of the estate. The sale never opened. Word reached the auction house instead that the man whose name was on the deed had died the night before, and the gavel that was meant to divide his possessions among strangers never fell. He died in New York City on the 2nd of December, 1936, 70 years old, 4 years removed from the boardroom vote that had already taken the company from him. The bank account behind him held $311. On paper, the estate told a different story. Appraisers valued it at roughly $23,500,000, the residue of a fortune that had once stood near $50 million and had, at its height, placed him among the wealthiest men in the country. But the paper figure was the wrong measure of the man, and it had been the wrong measure for years. Every dollar of the $23 million sat behind a wall of debt, mortgages, and pending litigation, the same wall that had been closing in since a fevered signature handed away half his circus stock, and a board of directors had voted him out of the company that carried his surname. He had built 5 circuses into one empire, dredged islands out of open water, raised a Venetian palace on the bay, and filled a museum with European Old Masters, and he died owning almost none of it outright. The house, the paintings, the causeway, the city he had helped will into existence around him, all of it remained standing. He did not. $311 was not a rumor passed down by tour guides. It was the figure in the bank ledger, the number that outlived every other number attached to his name once the estate went to appraisal. Other tallies from the same period drift by a few dollars depending on which ledger a clerk was reading from, but the story they all tell is the same one. A man who had once put down $1,700,000 in a single purchase to buy 5 rival circuses at once could not, on the day he died, have covered the cost of a modest hotel room out of pocket. Decide for yourself what to call a man who ends this way. Was John Ringling a builder who left an entire stretch of the Florida coast, its islands, its bridge, its art, to be sorted out after he was gone? Or was he a gambler who staked an empire on wounded pride at a boxing match and lost it one signed paper at a time until the fortune that built a city could not cover his own funeral costs without a fight in probate court? The record does not resolve the question. It only supplies both men, standing in the same suit, at the same graveside. What the newspapers noted, when they noted the death at all beneath bigger headlines about a country still climbing out of depression, was the contrast and little else. A man once counted among the wealthiest in America, a name on hotels and highways and a museum built to outlast him, gone with $311 to show for it. The furnishings that had been tagged for sale sat untouched in rooms nobody was yet permitted to empty. The paintings stayed on the walls. The palace stayed locked. He had spent the better part of 2 decades turning a stretch of mangrove coastline into a city, and the better part of the last decade of his life watching creditors, ex-wives, and his own board strip away everything that city had made possible for him personally. What was left when he died was not a settled account. It was a will written years before with the state of Florida as its principal heir, and a debt so entangled with that bequest that no one, not the executors, not the state, not the creditors circling the estate, yet knew whether the gift would ever actually reach the people it was written for. The auctioneer had priced the furniture. The state had not yet priced the fight it was about to inherit. Chapter 14. What the state fought 10 years to keep. The state had not yet priced the fight it was about to inherit, and the price, when it finally came due, was counted in years far more than in dollars. The will predated the emptied bank account by more than a decade. It named an heir nobody expected a circus proprietor to choose, not a nephew, not a rival branch of the family circling the estate, but the people of the state of Florida. To them, Ringling left the mansion standing on Sarasota Bay, the museum built beside it, the European Old Master paintings hung across its galleries, and an endowment of roughly $1,200,000 meant to keep the doors open once he was no longer alive to fund them. On paper, it read as the largest gift the state had ever been handed by a private citizen. In the courts, it read as an invoice attached to a decade of litigation, every mortgage still standing against Cadizan, every note still owed on the circus stock pledged at a prize fight years earlier, every creditor who had waited through the fever, the boardroom vote, and the funeral, now filed a claim against the same estate the will had promised to Tallahassee. The paper fortune the newspapers had quoted at his death, the $23,500,000, existed nowhere the state could simply collect it. It existed as a house, a painting collection, and a stack of debts, all tangled together in probate. Executors, state attorneys, and Ringling's creditors spent the years that followed arguing in courtrooms rather than galleries over what a dead man's promise was worth once the ledger behind it did not balance. The state did not walk away from the fight. It held its claim through 1946, 10 years after the will was read, before a court finally confirmed that the mansion, the museum, and the paintings on its walls belonged to Florida, and not to the men still chasing a dead circus king's signature. The victory did not put the money back in the bank account that had held $311 on the day he died. It secured something the balance never could. The mansion stayed furnished, the museum stayed open, and the old master paintings a circus fortune had bought stayed exactly where he had hung them, on walls the state now owned outright, instead of walls a creditor could strip and sell. The endowment ran the museum for more than half a century after that ruling, a state agency answering for a showman's Venetian palace and a collection he had spent circus profits shipping across an ocean to acquire, one gallery of a Gulf Coast property that had started as a fight over an unpaid interest installment and ended as a public trust. Then, in the year 2000, the Florida legislature moved the entire estate, the mansion, the museum, the collection, the grounds on Sarasota Bay, into the hands of Florida State University, which still operates the property today as the State Art Museum of Florida. The rest of what he built answers to nobody in particular now. The causeway, Ringling built and then gave to the city, still carries traffic onto the Keys every morning without a toll booth in sight. St. Armands Circle, laid out on land he and Owen Burns dredged out of open water, still rings with shoppers who have likely never heard the name of the man whose fortune raised the ground beneath their feet out of the bay. The islands themselves, sea-walled and filled in a project the state once called among the largest of its kind in Florida, carry houses and businesses that would sit underwater without the work his money and Burns's engineering did a century ago. Almost none of it still carries his name in a way anyone driving past would notice, and the coast he raised out of the bay has gone on without needing it. If you have ever driven that causeway, walked that circle, or stood inside Catazan looking out at the bay view a circus fortune paid to frame, you inherited a small, unpaid share of what he built, whether the creditors who chased his estate for 10 years ever collected a cent of it or not. The descendants of the men who dredged those islands, poured that causeway deck, and hung those paintings in a palace, none of them would ever own a room in, carried the same inheritance forward, unrecorded and unpaid, the same as the families of the show people who once toured under 5 circus names that all, for a few years, answered to him. If the part of this story that stays with you is what outlasts a fortune once the fortune itself is gone, following this channel is how the next one of these finds you. The islands are still there. The bridge still carries its traffic. The paintings still hang exactly where he placed them, in rooms a state fought a decade to keep open. Of the man who paid for all of it, the ledger kept only the number that outlived every other number attached to his name, $311 and 10 years of argument over what he left behind it.